do right here is go back. Way back. Back into time.
We can rebuild him. We have the technology.
Celebrating 20 years of New England Championship Wrestling. This is the ReGeneration Podcast.
And now, here are your hosts, Sheldon Goldberg, Joe Matterazzo, and Kevin Castro.
Welcome everyone to the ReGeneration Podcast. Sheldon Goldberg here, along with Joe Matterazzo and Kevin Castro. Gentlemen, good to have you aboard.
Nice to be here.
Very good to be here. Hope you guys are doing well. Hope everyone listening is doing well.
Absolutely. We want everyone to be safe and well. Take care of yourselves. Wear your mask. As you know, we just released about a week or so ago the 20th anniversary collection of 20 matches representing 20 years of New England Championship Wrestling. We're going to talk about two of those matches in depth on this program. Sean Burke versus Slyck Wagner Brown from November 9th of 2013, and Mercedes Martinez versus Beth Phoenix from August 9th, 2002. We're going to go in-depth on both of those, but before we get to that, we're going to take care of a few housekeeping details. We're going to tell you that we love you and we miss you. We miss doing live events, but we're not going to be doing any for the foreseeable future until situations change with the pandemic and Massachusetts opens itself up to being able to do live events in the future. Safely, yes. Very important.
Absolutely.
That's the most important thing. The safety of people on both sides of the curtain is the most important thing. I mean, wrestling is risky enough without all this COVID-19 stuff. There's no reason for us to be doing anything publicly at this point in time. We have not run our last show. We can assure you of that. When we're going to be running again, nobody really knows. Independent wrestling is taking a big hit with all of this that we are going through. We're going to talk about that in more detail at some point. But we do want people to be safe, and that's the most important thing. And we're also, at the same time, we're also looking at how to reinvent and reinvigorate our business. And we'll talk about that at a point down the road, too. We released the 20th anniversary collection, 20 matches that exemplify the quality of action of New England Championship Wrestling. It gives you a little insight into our history. It's not the definitive collection of matches, but it tells you a lot about who we are, what we've done, and what we might be doing in the not-too-distant future. So with that, we're going to start by talking about Sean Burke, who at the time of this matchup was the NECW Heavyweight Champion, taking on Slyck Wagner Brown, who was the second man to hold the NECW Heavyweight Championship. Let me ask you guys, before we sort of pick all this apart, what your impressions of the match were. Kevin, you were there at the time. Joe, you were not. So, Kevin, let me start with you. What were your impressions of this at the time that it was taking place?
Well, you figure during the shows I was behind the scenes, so I was working with everybody to get the promos done, so I very rarely would get to watch the matches live as they were happening. So just like everybody else, I would tune in and watch it when we were on television. Mm-hmm. Knowing the story going into it, knowing the character development of each wrestler, I thought it was very intriguing. You have Wagner, who is extremely charismatic. He has a connection with the fans that is very rarely matched. And then we had Sean Burke, who, is fresh off of a heel turn, the whole new method of him planning to, going into his matches. And it was just a very interesting dynamic. Two top workers.
Joe, what were your impressions when you watched the match?
Well, it's funny because, like Kevin said, I too, when I was involved, did a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff too. So I do the same. I know what it goes into when it comes time to watch the actual match, and kind of what the story is going on. So as I watch it, I wasn't even involved in this at this time, so I get to see the whole thing in real time, basically, for myself. Mm-hmm. seeing Kevin doing the interview and watching Sean Burke for the first time. I had never seen him before. I had never heard him before. Probably one of the most intense interviews I'd seen in a long time. Very realistic, very emotional. I thought it was really, really good. It was powerful. A lot of times guys will just yell and they just are loud. He was very articulate with his voice being as angry and the range being as high as it was, which made him stand out a little bit for me. He was very intelligent the way he came across, even though he was very upset and you could see the emotion in him. And then you get to Slyck, and I've known Slyck going on 20 years, right. And Slyck is Slyck, and he's got that charisma. And Sheldon, you and I talked about this off air. He has that charisma, that connection with the fans. And it doesn't even matter if he's playing the heel or playing the baby. He has that connection. And again, it was a great promo by him, showing his emotion going in, reacting to what Sean Burke was saying to him. And he set it up nicely, talking about the outside interference that had happened prior to Antonio Thomas. So now it sets the tone for the match itself. Then you get to the match, and the work rate was great. The story being told was fantastic, and they had me hooked from bell to bell. It was fantastic.
And if I can add one other thing too, they were so believable. Everything that Sean Burke said, you believed that he believed everything that he was saying. I mean, Sean Burke was, in my opinion, the total package of what a wrestler should be. He had the size, he had the personality, and he was believable.
He had the athletic ability for sure.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, but me never knowing him. Right. Never seen him. That was the first match I had seen that I really watched of him in the first interview, other than hearing about him, from just generalize of you guys. But that was the first I believed immediately watching him. I was like, yep, this is him.
That was
know what I mean? And
yeah, that was actually his second reign as champion. When we first put the title on him, very shortly after, he broke his ankle in a match with Antonio Thomas.
Oh, jeez.
And was out for like 6 months. And wow. When he recovered from that injury, the storyline, the backstory of the match is that Sean Burke, Jeremy Prophet, Genesis were this new breed of wrestler, the new generation. They were tired of seeing the top spots go to Antonio Thomas, who had been around for a long time, a former WWE guy, Slyck, Wagner, Brown, who'd been there forever. This was their time, and they were going to take over one way or another. So that was the conflict between those two teams and those two guys, and it was a very compelling story, a simple story, but a very compelling one. And Sean Burke was the one that came up with all that political stuff about the wussification of America and all that. That was totally him. We let him go on that and said, you feel strongly about that? That's what you want to do? You go do it. This is your platform. Stand and deliver, and he did.
He did.
Sean Burke had a relatively short career in wrestling. I want to say he started around, let me look this up, I have this down here. He started around 2011. And he only wrestled until about 2016. What happened with Sean is that as we went along with him, and as he got more and more exposure, what happens is other people see him and they want to book him and so forth. And he wanted to go do other things in other places, and he moved on from us. He ended up working for Chikara. He did some sort of a cartoonish gimmick called Flex Rumble Crunch. Yeah, I know.
You can't make this stuff up.
You can't make it up. Right. But he also, is a guy with a wife and a child, and I think he has 2 children now, if I'm not mistaken. But, those pressures of having to provide for a family, he had a window where he was trying to make it in wrestling. He had a tryout. He had a couple of tryouts. And for one reason or another, it just didn't happen for him. And he's out of the business now. I think some injuries played into it as well, Kevin, if I'm not mistaken. Didn't he have some neck issues?
Yeah, but one said that it was either his neck or his back, and you figure once your knees or your ankles go, it's rough.
It's one thing if you're single and you don't have any responsibilities, and
Right.
But it's a whole other thing when you've got a wife and children that depend on you, and you got to make the hard choices sometimes, and he did. The other side of the equation is Wagner Brown, and Wagner was the second person to hold the NECW championship. We had sort of an interesting history with Wagner. Wagner was, as I say, our second champion. He took over from Mike Hollow. Mike Hollow left us to join Chaotic Wrestling as their booker. He didn't tell us he was going to join Chaotic Wrestling as their booker, but that's what he did. We put the title on Wagner, and this was the time that Chaotic was just getting started. And we'll talk more about all that history at another point in time. But the point here is that Chaotic was offering local talent contracts. And by contracts, it was like a couple $100 a week or some silly thing like that. The guys were trying to work and trying to make it. That was something of substance to them, and they were going over there in droves. And rich guys were out there handing out the dough, and they were going to get in line to get their piece of it. So anyway, Wagner becomes our champion, taken over from Mike Hollow. Sure enough, a couple of months later, Wagner comes to us and says, "Oh, Chaotic offered me a contract." So Wagner was out the door. Difficult situation, but anyway, Wagner didn't work for us for a long time. I always believed in Wagner. I always thought Wagner was a guy who, as you said, Kevin, has an undeniable charisma, an undeniable connection with the fans that very few people in this area have. He's always a quality athlete. I go back with Wagner to the late 90s when he first started wrestling for the late Tony Rumble. It was him, Luis Ortiz, and Jason Rumble, who was at the time billed as Jason Rage, and they were a group called the 2K Club. And that was my first exposure to Wagner Brown, who was a Kowalski trainee. And Wagner had some heat on him, some backstage heat. He was in a relationship with April Hunter, who was a wrestler who was working with WCW as an NWO girl. She wanted to break into wrestling as a wrestler. She came up to Kowalski's to train. She was a former Playboy model. And now there was a volatile relationship between the two of them, Wagner and April. And Wagner's reputation suffered because of that relationship. They had some issues between them. And I don't think his career ever recovered from that, to be perfectly honest with you. And it's a shame because, there was another podcast that covers New England called the Wrestling Podcast About Nothing. Mike Crockett, local referee, and Brian Malonis did that podcast. And they did a show about who the top wrestlers in the history of New England wrestling are. And it was very chaotic-centric because they're chaotic guys. So, that's not to be unexpected because that's their experience. But Wagner was noticeably absent from that list, and that's a tragedy because I think Wagner Brown, in the modern history of independent wrestling in New England, he's a major player for sure.
Absolutely,
without any question of a doubt. You're talking about a guy who Wagner now has a school and he's training people and running his own shows. But Wagner was always a blue-chip athlete. I think his only real national exposure of any consequence was a group called the Urban Wrestling Federation, which was kind of short-lived, a short-lived project. And I can't think of the guy's name, but he was the guy that distributed ECW's TV show. I'll think of his name I'll bolt upright in the middle of the night and shout out his name, but I can't think of it right now. You know how that happens, age. But they had a thing called the Urban Wrestling Federation. It was kind of a hip-hop styled wrestling company, and Wagner was part of that, and that I think was his only significant national exposure. And I say, as I say, it's too bad. He's wrestled all over the world. Wrestled in England, wrestled in Japan, wrestled, in a lot of places. But for whatever reason, justly or unjustly, he wasn't able to click on the national level. I think it's a shame. But their loss,
missed out.
Their loss was our gain, especially in this period of the company where we were doing steady television and so forth. The guys who could lead the pack and tell a story and so forth were very valuable to us. So I think that particular match, and when you see it, it's one of the few matches in the series that comes from our TV show, and you see the opening promos, the pre-match promos, you see the open of the show, and so forth. We left all that in for context, but it kind of gives you a good flavor of what our television was like and the strength of the storytelling and the strength of what we were doing at that particular time. Then we're going to go backwards to 2002, August 9th of 2002, and Mercedes Martinez versus Beth Phoenix. Beth was actually not billed as Beth Phoenix. She was billed as the Fabulous Firebird Phoenix. She was living in Niagara Falls at the time. Not in the falls, but next to the falls, because she was in the falls, she'd be rather moist. But anyway, be that as it may, she was training and working with Ron Hutchinson in Toronto with a group called the Apocalypse Wrestling Federation. There was a tag team that had been introduced to me by a guy in upstate New York who was a good friend and who was a magazine writer who would come around quite a bit by the name of Donnie Leibel. And the All-Nighters were a great tag team. We don't have them in this particular series, but I'm sure that at some point we'll be unearthing some All-Nighters matches. They were quite an entertaining duo, and one of them was the boyfriend or the fiance of Beth Phoenix. So Beth would come in with them, and she was great. From the time that she first came in the door, she was a very good worker. Mercedes Martinez was the first woman to ever wrestle for NECW. And I'll tell the story of how she got to wrestle for us, which is one of those typical stories where many times in wrestling things happen not by plan but by accident. She was training with Jason Knight in Connecticut and had come along to one of the shows, and as luck would have it, good or bad, one of the guys who was scheduled to be on the show couldn't make it because he had to work late, or his car broke down, or his dog got sick, or his dog ate his homework, or I don't know. Whatever reason, he didn't make the show. So we were short a person. And, we're trying to figure out what to do, and one of the guys, Purdy Curdy, said, "Hey, what about Mercedes? I'll work with her. We didn't have another girl at the time, so I'll work with her, no problem." All right. Well, as soon as she walked through the curtain, the place lit up. She had that kind of raw charisma without knowing that. No promo, no anything. She didn't know what she was doing at that particular time, at least outside the ring. But the people just responded to her right away. And at that point, we knew we had something with her, and we started to book women. And that began our commitment to women's wrestling in NECW, which really is a very significant thing. In the 20th anniversary collection, there are actually 7 women's matches, which gives you an idea of how important women's wrestling was to the company. But let me ask the two of you, one at a time, what your impressions were of the match. It's actually, I think, wrestling-wise, one of the weakest matches in the collection, but it's interesting for who's in it. Kev?
Like you were just saying, wrestling-wise, I thought that if you are training to wrestle, male or female, to watch that match should be inspiring, because you can see two people who, granted they went on separate paths, but now it seems like they're both going to end up in the same place. You have Beth Phoenix, who was extremely successful in WWE, Hall of Fame career, and Mercedes, who is there now, who is the world has not been able to see what she can do yet. And I just think it's interesting that you see them from the beginnings, knowing where they ended up.
Yeah. Joe?
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's funny to sit back and watch because we already know the end story. We already know where they end up.
Right.
Now you get to see when they began, and it's funny that they're where they are right now is back together again with Beth calling the action and Mercedes in the ring, and they started out, and you see, just like you said, you see they're not polished, they're not smooth. You know, the physiques are off. Like you can tell, you see the shape that Beth Phoenix got herself into,
right,
from where she started, and she was not in bad shape. Don't get me wrong,
right.
But just how much more muscle she packed on, and then developing the Glamazon persona. But she still had that confidence then. You could see the stardom in both of them from day one, watching that match. And then to see where they took it is just a testament to the hard work and dedication. And I think everybody should definitely check out that match.
Absolutely.
Especially if you want to be in the business.
Right. And both of them, you could definitely say both of them paid their dues big time. Mercedes maybe more so than Beth, although that's not to take anything away from Beth at all. Beth came up the hard way. She wrestled on the independents for quite a bit. She went to OVW. She was moonlighting as a waitress to try to get money and sustain herself while she was working out there. You can see how she got herself into tremendous physical condition, how the changes to her body that she's made over the years. Mercedes as well. Mercedes had a very different sort of path. She kind of wasn't accepted for a while. You know, that was a time when the business was looking for divas, and she wasn't a diva. You know, she didn't want to play to that. She wanted to be who she was, and I have the utmost respect for her for that. You know, we kept trying to get her to soften her look and to be more diva-ish, so to speak, but that wasn't her. She wasn't going to have anything of it. She was a better talent than most of the guys on our roster at the time. Unfortunately, we did have a booker at one point in Bob Evans who hated her with a passion, did not want to do business with her, did not want to work with her, and actually drove her away. But by that point, she had been with us for about 5 years, and it was time for her to go different places. You know, she wasn't going to be able to progress as a talent. She was so much better than anybody that was working for us at that point, male or female, that she really needed to be in a different spot to be able to make the most of her career. She had a long road, including overcoming some serious injuries, a number of shoulder surgeries and so forth. But she's a terrific girl, and boy, talk about an inspiring story. Someone who, at this point in time in her career, to just be making it now and having that opportunity, she's really beaten the odds in a major way by getting into WWE at this point in time in her career. And I just hope that she has some longevity there, and that you know, that she makes the most of her minutes, so to speak. But you're right. It's interesting to see them at the beginning of their careers. It just goes to show you that's why an NECW isn't important for wrestling as an industry, because those people needed a platform that they didn't have otherwise. They needed a place to go and work in front of people and so forth. You know, I did an interview with Mike Johnson of PW Insider, who we'll eventually have on this show at some point. But I was saying to him that we weren't a company that was training people. We didn't have a school. We weren't in the business of training people. We were the step that you take once you've been to wrestling school. You've learned how to have a match. You've learned how to fall. You've learned how to do the basics. Now it's time to put it into practice and that's what we are. This company is people's first step in putting it into practice, and that's why it's important. That's why it has such a history, because at the time, in 2002, there was no Ring of Honor. There was no Impact Wrestling. There were a lot of these independent companies just didn't exist. Independent wrestling was still a relatively new thing. So us being there and being able to give people like this a platform, and that was an important thing for us to do. It was a great thing for the audience. If you were an NECW fan in that era, look at the people that you got a chance to see. Granted, they weren't stars at the time, but if you look back on it and say, holy moly, these people got to see Doug Williams, they got to see John Cena, they got to see Frankie Kazarian, they got to see Beth Phoenix, they got to see all these people who went on to bigger and better things in an early stage of their career. So if you were an NECW fan back then, you had a front row seat to the future of pro wrestling.
Yeah, there's no doubt. It is funny because this is why the territory system worked in the day.
That's right.
And without the territory system, you don't have that ability to, when you get out of a wrestling school, to be able to go from place to place. You only get to work up to the people that you're working with. Right. And at one point, you're going to end up working down to the people you're working with. And so someone like Mercedes needed to move on at that point.
Absolutely.
In order to find people to work up to.
Right.
And was that the vision of the company to begin with, too, that, NECW was there to build people up and see people on the way up, as opposed to using the stars that are kind of on their way down? We were using more local talent.
That's right.
Basically from the beginning.
That's correct. And that was an important part of what we were doing. I mean, it's easy to book stars. Kev. It's easy to book stars. It doesn't take talent to book a star.
No, money mark. That's all you need.
That's it. I mean, that's to me, that's not promoting anything. If a guy's already over, he's promoting you, not the other way around. This is what NECW was and is a wrestling promotion in the truest sense of the word. We're actually taking people that you may not know and giving them angles and programs and storylines and building them up to where you get to know them. You get to see them not just have matches, but you get to see them tell stories. You get to see them go from point A to point B to point C, moving up and down the card. And believe it or not, when we started the company, that was a radical concept. What do you mean you're not going to run with stars? Who are your stars going to be? I got that quite a bit from people. In fact, one individual who worked for us at one point, who was a ring announcer, no longer working with us, said to me, if you don't start booking the big names, you're going to be out of business in 6 months. And that was 20 years ago. He said that to me. So much for that prediction. But no, it was you gotta realize that was radical thinking at the time, to get rid of the names and just book local guys and try to get people to care about them. That was something that wasn't done at that time. I mean, it sounds simple, but it was definitely bucking the trend, that's for sure.
Well, it's hard to get established names and established guys, established stars, to put over the new generation coming up. It's really hard for them to, especially like what Kevin said, they're on their way down. Right. So they're just trying to make their money. The last thing they want to do is drop their stock by, losing to a local guy that has no name in order to put him on the map. There's nothing in it for them to do it that way. And it's difficult.
Yeah, and let's face it, it's not like we were running a lot of shows then. We were running once every 4 to 6 weeks. So, it wasn't like we had a full-time schedule of shows that people could work. And, we just, we were out there and we were doing things. It did pick up. We did get sold shows. We did get things. It did pick up after a while. But, originally it was every 4 to 6 weeks. We'd have a show at good times when we could get it. And, Occasionally we do shows in other places, and then we try to build the business up from there. But like I say, it's not like we could run a consistent schedule of shows that would make it worthwhile to bring in names like that on a regular basis. So we were forced in a very real way to use that local talent to build our business with. And, the other thing, too, is when you have shows that feature name headliners, that's what the show's about.
Right.
It doesn't matter. The other guys can just be there. When you go to see, and this is not a put down of them at all, but when you go to big time wrestling, you don't care that, Harry High Spots is in a hot feud with, Danny Dropdown or whatever. You don't care about that. You're there to see the names. That's what their show is about, and that doesn't make it a bad show. That doesn't make them bad people. It's not a negative. It's one way of doing business, but this was a different way of doing business. Did we leave money on the table by doing it that way? Maybe, probably, but to me, it was just much more interesting and much more rewarding to do what we were doing, which is to actually promote wrestling, to actually promote people, and tell stories like this. That was more interesting to me than rubbing elbows with a bunch of names. And not that we didn't know them, because we knew them, but and we did use names here and there on an occasional basis, but not to overwhelm them. Yeah, it meant something, right?
Right. It meant something.
Right.
It was to further a story, or further an angle, and to make something. Either it was the payoff at the end.
Right.
They were used in a critical way.
Mm-hmm. Another thing about these two particular matches, and the reason that I wanted to go over them with you on this show, is they also demonstrate another key part of NECW, which is diversity. To have a diverse locker room, racially, in terms of men and women, that's important. Many times in independent wrestling, you guys have seen it. It's the old treehouse attitude. We're the boys in the treehouse, and no girls are allowed, and we're the kids in the clubhouse, and if you don't look like us, you can't belong, or whatever. That's BS.
Right.
In my opinion, I don't. I wanted to have a wrestling company that reflected society, that reflected the makeup of the
our
world.
Audience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It doesn't make any sense not to do it that way. People need, at least on our level, need to identify with what they're seeing. And it's a meritocracy, but it ought to be reflective of society as well. Mercedes was the first woman to work for us, but women's wrestling became very, very important. I always felt that, I wanted to feature women's wrestling, but I wanted to feature it the right way. I wanted to give it its just due. And, I got a lot of resistance when I first started promoting all women's shows. A lot of resistance. I mean, people actively tried to sabotage those shows because they didn't like the idea that we were going to push women. I mean, it sounds ridiculous now, given what wrestling's become, but that was the attitude then. Strange as it seems, I don't regret that at all. I think that's one of the best things that NECW has ever done, which is to do World Women's Wrestling and to have all women's shows. Before that, Kevin, what was women's wrestling in New England? You maybe saw a match on a card, and that was it.
That was pretty much it. That was you would have women, you would have a battle royal, and then maybe little people.
Right.
Right.
It was almost a gimmick.
Exactly. I mean, women were traditionally booked as a special attraction.
They're just going to say
in this part of the country. You'd have a women's match or a midget match on a WWF card. That was the special attraction. Something for Dad to look at while a kid was marking out to Bruno or Pedro or whoever, whatever. But as time went on, women, the idea of having women's wrestling being taken seriously, there was Glow, which was not taken seriously at all, but it highlighted the fact that that's an asset to our business that wasn't being properly utilized. So I have been a supporter of women's wrestling for many, many years. I was friendly with the late Fabulous Moolah and Mae Young. They gave me a very different appreciation of women's wrestling because those women were working in professional sports when it was not so hip or not so common for women to do things like that. So there were some brave ladies. There were some brave and revolutionary ladies in their own way. And to see women's wrestling evolve the way that it has, and to know that we played somewhat of a role in that is a very gratifying thing. But diversity very important for NECW. And I'll tell you. Speaking of diversity, I'll tell you another quick story where I allowed a booker to kind of call the shots on something that I wanted to do, and it got shot down. If you guys remember, in early Ring of Honor, there was a tag team called the Christopher Street Connection.
Yep.
Do you remember these guys?
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So they're two guys who were supposed to be gay, and when they would come, they would like make out with each other. They would like tongue each other, and I mean, people went nuts when they saw these guys. But I saw something different. I saw a chance for us to, again, make our product a little more diverse. I wanted to. They were actually managed originally in Ring of Honor by Ariel. If you remember that, Kevin, do you remember that?
Mm-hmm. I do.
Yeah. I wanted to bring them in and put them over as baby faces. Tone down the making out with each other a little bit, but I wanted them to be heroes. The idea of a gay tag team being heroes, that was revolutionary. Usually when in wrestling, when you saw somebody who was portraying a gay person or an exaggerated gay persona, that was a heel gimmick automatically. I saw it as an opportunity to diversify wrestling and bring in a different audience. I had a whole plan where we were going to pitch this as a story to the gay community news and say, here, for the first time in wrestling, here's a couple of gay men who are heroes. Well, first of all, Christopher Street Connection weren't gay. So, but be that as it may, we didn't get another shot at that until a few years later when we had the Crown Jewels.
Right.
That was a different kind of a gimmick in some respects, but we'll have Darling Damon, one half of the Crown Jewels, on at some point in time to talk about that gimmick in more depth. But that was something that I wanted to do, and the booker at the time, Bob Evans, was having nothing to do with it. He pitched a fit when I said, this is what I want to do. I want to make them baby faces. He thought that was like, hellfire and brimstone would come down if we ever did something like that. He wanted no part of that whatsoever. So, but I felt very strongly about it. Yeah. Amazing
how times have changed, right?
Yeah, and amazing how when I tell you this story, how ahead of the curve we were on so many things.
Right. Right.
It sounds silly now that we talk about it, but again, at that particular time, these things were not being done. These things were not happening in wrestling, and I thought they would be good for the business. I still think they're good for the business now. So I think we've covered the waterfront on those two matches. We're going to pick another two matches to talk about on our next episode of this podcast. I want to ask you guys what you've been watching lately. I've got one that we'll get to in a minute. But Kevin, what have you been watching lately?
Well, during the quarantine, I want to know when Netflix sends out the law degrees with all the documentaries that I had been watching, the true crime. I believe I hit all of them. So I do believe I'm a lawyer now.
Okay.
Wrestling-wise, been watching a lot of AEW. I do like that. I do like the fact that they're building new stars, which is something that hasn't really happened in 15 years or so. Routinely, I'll have Raw on, I'll have SmackDown on. I'm normally doing other things. It's more like it's in the background.
Right.
I did enjoy NXT for a while. Once it moved to USA, not so much that I didn't have interest in it. I was just more interested in AEW and even Impact. It took me a while to remember that it was on Tuesdays,
right,
at the time. But I've been watching that as well.
Joe, how about you?
To get to the Netflix thing, I binge watched Cobra Kai. Got through that. I was a huge Karate Kid mark growing up, and to see the way the story's developed over the last 2 seasons, can't wait for season 3 on that. Tiger King, just a guilty pleasure of watching that. If you haven't seen it, my God, it's like a train wreck that you cannot watch or look away from. It was.
Right.
So that's it. It's
right.
pro wrestling with live tigers.
Right.
That's all. That's the only difference of that.
Right.
And then to find out the backstory behind
you've been in wrestling
Joe Exotic.
You've been in wrestling too long when anything you watch is related to pro wrestling.
Just
you
about
can
everything.
draw a wrestling analogy to anything, right? I'm sorry, go ahead.
We can make a connection.
Right.
And then the same thing. I love AEW. I love how they're making the new stars come up, showcasing these young kids. Some of the great kids that are out there on the indie scene. Before the pandemic hit, I was really into what NWA Power was doing. Was really liking. I love that old school feel,
right,
with the old studio look. It really, what really got me. You saw the old school setup with the studio and the handful of people inside of there, and it felt so intimate. The sound of the ring. Yes. When they hit that, it brought back. That's what brought back Gordon Soley and Dusty Rhodes and the Road Warrior in that ring. That sound echoing inside. It was so nostalgic. And then, like you said, same thing. Monday nights, I'm on Raw's on TV. It's just on. SmackDown. I love what's going on SmackDown right now. What they're doing with Roman Reigns, long overdue. And other than that, now I'm enjoying our 20th year series that's out there right now. Getting caught up, and I'm going digging on other stuff now, going back and really enjoying the nostalgic.
We gave people enough to watch.
That's
apart from that series, we'll also talk about the Legendary series, which is another 12-video series that we did a few years ago. We'll talk about that at some point. A couple of things that I've been watching lately that I want to share with you. One is the United Wrestling Network weekly pay-per-view series, Primetime Live, well worth your while. Going out of your way to see that. It's a collaboration, I should say, between Dave Marquez and the United Wrestling Network and the NWA. So you're going to see a lot of NWA stars. You mentioned NWA Power. You're going to see Nick Aldis. You'll see Thunder Rosa. You'll see Eli Drake, some of the NWA stars on that. That's a great watch. It's 90 minutes every Tuesday night. It's on live from 9 to 10:30 on Tuesday nights. It's a pay-per-view. You can get it on the Fight Network. If you have the Fight app, either on your Roku or your phone or whatever, or your computer, that's how you can watch that. I tell you what I watched this past weekend. I have a very good friend who is a film critic, and Joe, if you remember back on the Mouthpiece Wrestling Show, we had him on 1 or 2 times, Ed Simkus.
Oh, Ed Simkus, yeah, absolutely.
Right. Ed Simkus is a film critic. He did a wrestling radio show years before we did one called Wrestle Radio USA. But he got a hold of me and said, you got to check out this movie called You Cannot Kill David Arquette.
Yes, I heard about this.
I watched it this past weekend.
Fantastic.
Yes. You've seen it. Okay. I had not seen it until this past weekend. It's on Amazon Prime. It's not free, though. You do have to rent it, but it's only a couple of bucks. And it's worth your while going out of your way to see. It's David Arquette trying to redeem himself in the world of pro wrestling. And it's well worth your time. I won't give you any spoilers, but it's well worth your time to go out of your way and watch that. So that's what I've been watching this week.
I heard David Arquette in an interview talking about the documentary and what he went through and how he went through, and he was 100% legit. Wanted to rectify what happened to him the last time around. He just did it because he thought this was the greatest thing in the world. He wanted to be involved.
I wanted to get him out here for us.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and
absolutely.
I couldn't make that connection, unfortunately. But
I was pushing for a while to get David Arquette and Macaulay Culkin. I wanted to do that match. And I want to say I was pushing that for Milford. Was it 2 years ago? Milton, yeah.
Right.
Milton. Yep, we were talking about that.
Yeah.
I was pushing for.
No, I did try to reach out to him to get him to come out here for us, and unfortunately that did not take place. But David, if you're listening to this podcast, when we're up and running again, you've got an open invitation. You're booked, pal. You're booked if you want it. We are going to have guests in the future, maybe not for our first couple of episodes, but we will be having guests from NECW past, maybe also some non-NECW guests that might be intriguing to have on. I can think of several that I would like to talk to. I think that the three of us would like to have some in-depth conversations with some legends and so forth. I think that'd be a lot of fun. But anyway, I want to thank you for listening in this week, and hopefully you'll join us again next week. Until then, stay safe, be well, and we're going to pick a couple more matches for you to go over with us next week. The matches that we went over this week will be linked in the description below, so you can check those out if you haven't checked them out previously. And once again, for Kevin Castro and Joe Matterazzo, I'm Sheldon Goldberg. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
The ReGeneration Podcast is a production of New England Championship Wrestling. To send us questions, comments, or feedback, email us at regenerationnecw@gmail.com. That's regenerationnecw@gmail.com.